Summary of the Enormous Radio by John Cheever. Jim and Irene Westcott are a typical middle-class pair in New York City. They have 2 young children. The only thing they have in common is that they both like music, but they don't want other people to know that. When the couple's old radio stops working, they buy an expensive new one that looks very out of place in Irene's carefully decorated living room. Irene tries to get used to this new radio, but she has to hide it behind a sofa because it looks evil. Irene tries to listen to the radio, but all she hears are things like doorbells, elevator bells, electric razors, and other sounds from around the house. She learns that the radio is not playing music, but is instead sending sounds from other apartments in the building. When Jim tries to use the radio, he hears the same thing: a conversation, phones ringing, and other interference. He tells Irene that he will call a repairman to fix their new radio. When Irene turns on the radio the next morning, after it has been fixed, she hears a recording of the Missouri Waltz played over and over. Later that night, Jim comes home, and he and Irene listen to the radio while they eat dinner. The music is interrupted by a man's voice, and the Westcotts can hear them fighting with a woman named Kathy. The man is annoyed by Kathy's piano playing, especially after a long day at work. Jim thinks that the conversation is just a radio play, but Irene tells him to change the station on the radio. When he does, another discussion comes out of the loudspeaker. 2 more times, Jim switches stations, and 2 more conversations can be heard in the Westcott's living room. Jim still thinks it's impossible for the radio to let them hear what their neighbors are saying, but Irene finally hears more than one voice. She asks him to look for one set of neighbors on purpose, and they make a game out of it. As they do this, they hear many private talks, including a bitter family quarrel about money. Because they now know how bad their friends are, the Westcotts go to bed feeling good about themselves and weak with laughter. The next day, Irene purposely listens in on what her neighbors are saying and hears about carnal love, abysmal vanity, faith, and despair. Irene seems to be a simple and sheltered woman, so what the radio says upsets her. When she gets into the elevator of her building with some neighbors, she suddenly doesn't trust them. She looks at their faces and thinks what secrets they might be hiding. When Irene's friend comes to lunch with her, Irene even wonders if her friend is hiding something to look normal. Irene goes home to listen to more talks, and the intensity of what she hears grows. By the time Jim gets home from work, Irene is fed up with how secretive and dishonest her neighbors are all the time. Later that night, while walking with Jim, she tells him that the street singers seem so much nicer than the Westcott's friends. The next night, when Jim comes home, Irene is crying and won't stop. She tells Jim that their neighbor, Mr. Osborne, beats his wife. She begs Jim to talk to Mr. Osborne about the abuse because she can't handle society's unspoken rule of quiet. But instead of helping, Jim turns off the radio, giving Irene the option to stop hearing and act like she doesn't know how cruel Mr. Osborne is. Even though Irene wanted to keep Ms. Osborne out of danger at first, she eventually agreed with Jim and let the radio stay off. She then gives a long list of their neighbors' problems. For example, she says that the Hutchinsons can't pay for hospital care for a family member, and she goes on to list the other renters' affairs, fights, and worries. Irene then asks Jim to confirm that, compared to the other family, theirs is good, decent, and loving. Jim says that the Westcotts are happy as a family. The radio is fixed the next day by another repairman. Irene turns it on and is glad that the neighbors are no longer able to hear what she is saying. But when Jim gets home, he looks upset and tells the family that the radio is more than they can afford. He then asks Irene why she lied to him about her unpaid clothing bills. He says that he worries a lot about money and that he thinks his life is a waste. Irene is worried that the neighbors will hear them fighting, so she asks Jim to be quiet. Jim, on the other hand, is tired of her behavior and asks her why she is being so righteous. He says that Irene has done many evil things, such as stealing her mother's jewelry, keeping money from her sister, and going to an abortionist. Irene clings to the radio dial as Jim keeps yelling, hoping to hear something comforting. Instead, a radio announcer reports the weather and repeats railroad tragedy statistics.
About the author. John Cheever was the middle-class family's second son. His father used to be a famous shoemaker in New England, but when the economy went down, he lost money and the family got into financial trouble. Cheever went to Thayer Academy when he was young, but he was later kicked out. He wrote a short story called Expelled, which was published in the New Republic in 1930. In 1938, he worked in Washington, D.C., as an editor for the Federal Writers Project. In 1941, he married Mary Winternitz. In 1942, Cheever joined the Army and joined the Signal Corps. A year later, in 1943, he released The Way Some People Live, his first book of short stories. Cheever's short stories appeared in many magazines, like The Atlantic and The New Republic, but he was most often linked with the New Yorker's style and sense of beauty. After the war, Cheever moved his family to Sutton Place in Manhattan, then to the suburbs, and finally to Ossining, New York, where he lived from 1961 on. Many of the stories in his collections, The Enormous Radio and Other Stories, 1953, and The Stories of John Cheever, 1978, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the National Book Critics Circle Award in 1979, are clearly influenced by this neighborhood setting. The Wapshott Chronicle, his first book, won the U.S. National Book Award for Fiction in 1957. Even though Cheever was well known, his personal life was hard. He drank a lot, saw a psychiatrist for depression, and had multiple affairs with both men and women. He died in 1982 from cancer.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.